So glad we remembered that. So, yeah, we're going over game packaging today. A really nice, straightforward course. It should just give you some good information on how to package your games. We've got two TAs in the thread as well. So if anyone has any questions that need elaborating on, they can and grab your questions. And hopefully, because game packaging is kind of a case by case basis, everyone's going to have different projects with slightly different issues. Hopefully, we can at least get you all to a good place today and throughout the week, of course. So the main thing is that just game packaging could not be easier in Unreal Engine. So for those of you who haven't already tried approaching this, just go to platforms in your editor window. I assume everyone's on Windows right now, but you can go to Windows and just hit Package Project. And just following those three steps, that will allow you to package project. And what should happen is then you go make a quick coffee. I've got a glass of water, whatever you'd prefer to drink. You've got to make sure you drink something because packaging could take a little while. If it's the first time you package your project, it could take up to an hour. It depends what content you have in, what Unreal is trying to cook. You might have a super small project. Whatever happens, the project will package, and then you should end up with a packaged project on your desktop. Wherever you set that file location to be, you should have an executable version of the game, and you'll be able to double click it, open it up, and run it. And I mean, I don't want to over elaborate on the complexity of game packaging, and that's essentially all you need to know. So, yeah, I don't know if you have any questions. I don't know, James, do we have time for a Q&A? I'm not sure how long we're supposed to be running today, but that's essentially the class there.
So we do have one question,
Okay,
which is, what's the difference between debug game development and shipping builds when
cool.
packaging?
Okay. So it sounds like we do have a few questions, and maybe we should elaborate a little bit more on game packaging. So yeah,
So you're not
let's
done.
have, yeah. So let's just crack on. Okay, so let's get into game packaging a little bit more. I know some people may have a few questions. Okay, what are all these options that I'm seeing? It's not as simple as those three steps. I get it. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of context, I do a lot of design work. Historically, my background is in level design, and I started modding Unreal Tournament 2004, and I've just been using Unreal Engine since. So my kind of perfect day, if I can spend all day in Unreal Engine, I would love to. Generally, as my career has progressed, the Unreal Engine hours get less and less as more responsibilities arise. But we've essentially shipped three original IP games: Ether One back in 2014, The Occupation in 2019, and Daily View in 2022. And at our studio as well, we also work with companies like Devolver. We do a bunch of stuff with Epic and Raw Fury. And I've also shipped a couple of other more AAA style games in the Lego franchise. But that's essentially my background. Love design. I do cinematics, level design, and then just help with production side of games as well, more and more. So it kind of nicely ties into three P's in this packaging course. You've got the project settings, which some of you may have opened by now. If you're in week 3, you may have gone up to that project settings tab and kind of had a little poke around in there. We'll cover some nice project settings in this class. We'll talk about packaging for both solo projects. So, how do I just package the game? And then also maybe some workflow changes with a larger team. Some of you may be in teams that are thinking about moving over to Unreal Engine. You have some existing processes or build automations in place, and you're wondering how Unreal might be able to support your studio. And then we'll also briefly touch upon publishing your project. Some people from the last fellowship have said, I want to publish my game. I want to make an Epic Games Store page. How can I go about doing this? And we'll cover those steps because, as we said at the start of the fellowship, this work is your own. All the course material belong to Epic. They are not your materials. However, the games that you create are yours. And if you decide to publish it and make an Epic store page or whatever kind of distribution format you want to pick, you're able to do that as part of this fellowship, which is a really nice opportunity. So first we'll dig into project settings. A little shout out to the Plucky Squire today. It is the release date of the Plucky Squire. So for those of you that are excited about this game, you can go and buy it now. James did a bunch of work. James, the TA on this call, did a bunch of work on Plucky Squire. I did a tiny amount, but our studio has supported with Plucky Squire, and All Possible Futures are a great studio. So anyone interested in Plucky Squire, you can grab that now. What are the project settings? So project settings allow you to customize a project. So you'll be able to update your project's thumbnail. So if any of you have seen the custom splash screen that is loaded with your project templates, with the Epic templates, we'll show you how to update that. Maybe you want your own game loading thumbnail, and we'll go into that today. You can add splash movies. So if you want a little video to play at the start of your executable, you know, your studio icon or logo, sorry, along with, you know, made in Unreal Engine, whatever kind of splash movie you want, we can add those in project settings. We can edit input configurations. Now, most of you will have been using enhanced input on the fellowship, but you can also just change some input mappings in the project settings as well. And you can also just choose which map to load on startup. So if your editor is always loading in a different map than what you're working in, we can change that. And also just the map to load, which you'll want to change in your packaged game for when you come to submit them. This is where you would set that. So you can edit properties in the config folder as well. So when you have your Epic templates folder, for example, you'll see your U project file, which is the blue icon. You'll see the content folder, which is where all your textures and meshes and blueprints live. You'll also see a config folder, and some of those project settings are edited directly into the config folder. So you can load up the config folder outside of project settings if you want, but just the project settings are a little bit more user-friendly. They have the nice UI because they're in Engine. And it's just a little bit easier to change. So it's just a note in case you did want to edit those configs. So project settings can be loaded from, if you go to the Edit tab at the top of your window and just go down to project settings. So for anyone following along, that is where you would find your project settings. And there's many properties in project settings. They essentially handle how your project is going to be loaded. So just to give you a little explanation, there's a difference between editor preferences and project settings. Editor preferences are going to be anything that's local to your workspace. So if you're changing how you want icons to be viewed in editor, or you're changing the load up profile of your editor layout, that's all editor preferences. Whereas the thing that the player is going to be playing in your game, they're going to be project settings. So that's kind of a good way to differentiate the two. But as you can see, it has all the global settings here as part of your project. And it's up to you what you want to kind of change and customize. You can already see here just on the initial page, you can enter your company name or give yourself a home page or support contact, game description, game thumbnail, all of these things. So in most cases, it's fun to just poke around and just figure out what different things do, and you'll no doubt find an option that appeals to you. But we'll also cover some of the high-level information that you might want to know about when packaging your project. So again, it's worth covering these project settings in your own time. Some things that you may want to consider is editing the way AI uses navigation in your project. You can edit the overall global AI navigation properties here. If any of you have heard about Lumen, which is Unreal's dynamic global illumination system, you can change the global illumination method in project settings, and also just change custom things about how physics are handled, for example. So the really useful thing is that there's a search bar at the top of project settings. So rather than scrolling through all the settings to try and find what you need, sometimes just typing in the keyword in there will bring up the project setting that you need. So that search bar is in a lot of Unreal Engine's UI. So just make sure you utilize that. You may not know specifically what you're looking for, but searching some key terms might be helpful in that. And the kind of main thing to know about packaging in Unreal Engine is that Unreal will try to cook everything. So if you don't edit the project settings or packaging options, Unreal will default just package everything, which, you may not be too bothered about the package sizes, but especially if you're distributing these games to players, maybe on a digital storefront, or even just via a download link, a couple of gigabytes can be a lot to different people's bandwidth. So trying to reduce the package sizes and only cook the content that you need to is a worthwhile thing to pursue. And also depends on the platform that you're trying to ship on. Maybe PC only won't be as impacted as, say, trying to ship on a Nintendo Switch or an iOS device, for example. So, we'll look at how to kind of reduce some of those package sizes. And it's just default behavior. Unreal wants to make it quick and easy to get up and running with packaging your project. So as you saw in my slightly kind of flippant example at the start where, we just package the game and we're all done and we're finished. Technically, it is that easy. As long as you've got your Visual Studio issues out of the way and you've got the correct SDKs installed, things like this, once the kind of Visual Studio side is handled, packaging your game is very straightforward. And if you just start with an empty default template, like the first person template, you can package that in a matter of minutes, and, building out content from there then gets more complex, essentially. Let's cover some content cooking. What does Unreal handle for you by default, and what might you want to change and customize? So the cooking of the project essentially grabs all these different file formats. So you might have a PNG as a texture, or you might have a WAV file for some audio. And essentially the cooking process, Unreal takes all these kind of raw file formats and converts them to something that can be read on platforms. So you'll see throughout this presentation, I've got documentation links at the bottom of the page. You can download this presentation, follow the links. You can rabbit hole on these resources very quickly. But if you're wanting to understand how different platforms cook different types of content, then that documentation link is there. But essentially, we take all these file formats and convert them to what can be read on maybe a console platform, for example. So we can change the cook behavior in the project settings by going to the Advanced tab and then ticking Cook Only Maps. And if you only want to cook the maps, it cooks the content within those maps, but it only gets the maps that you want to cook, for example, that are part of your project. So this is kind of a catch-all for all maps in your project. There is also a maps to cook option, which allows you to only include a list of maps. So you'll see in the second image, if you type maps to cook, that bottom option that says list of maps to include in a package build, instead of the top option where you're just saying, just get on my maps, cook them, not too bothered. My project's quite clean. Any map that's there is fine to cook. That could be one option and a more straightforward option. If you have maybe 5 specific levels and all your other levels have just been test levels where you're just trialing out mechanics and they don't need to be in the packaged version of the game, you could just include an array of those 5 levels in the list of maps to include, and it will only cook those 5 maps. So we're getting into a little bit of customization there on how to cook specific maps in your project. There's kind of 2 big tools inside of Unreal Engine that, especially if you want a little bit more complexity in terms of maybe how assets are being loaded, or maybe on what platforms you're wanting to deploy your projects to, you'll want to look in these 2 directions. And I'll go into specifically what they are in the next couple of slides as well. But on one side, you've got the Asset Manager. And the Asset Manager gives you a little bit more control about how assets are being loaded into memory, and especially if you're trying to optimize your game, the asset manager will be something to look for. And then the project launcher can be useful when you're trying to deploy to maybe an iOS device and an Xbox console and maybe a Nintendo Switch, for example. If you're trying to package for multiple projects, that project launcher can be very helpful to you. So the asset manager, starting with the first option there, is a singleton global U object. And so for the non-programmers like myself on the call, you can think of a singleton, U object as just it exists once. It's single. It's just got one version of it. So sometimes in Unreal, you can have multiple instances of the same actor, whereas the good thing about the asset manager is just one exists. So whenever you have the game at runtime, there's only ever one asset manager. And this is useful because that should know about all the content that's being loaded and unloaded and streamed in. You wouldn't want multiple versions of this asset manager because you'd get confused about what's in memory. So good thing about the asset manager is there's only one. It's like an engine subsystem. So there's no confusion of how to access the asset manager. It's not map or mode specific. So if you change game mode mid gameplay, you don't get a brand new asset manager with it. It's just there's one example of the asset manager in your project. So it's essentially categorizes and queries assets using the asset registry, and it maintains global asset loading state. So it always knows what's loaded, it always knows what's unloaded, and it can integrate into existing systems like cooking and async loading. And it's designed, there's a framework in place, and it's designed to be overridden for what you need. So if you're someone or you're a team that cares about the optimization of how assets and specific classes are being loaded and unloaded, you might want to check out this YouTube link. It's an Unreal Engine stream, so it's made by Epic. And it's a really good deep dive about what the asset manager is, what it does, and how to configure it into your projects. So definitely check out that link if you're interested in that content. So what you can do is specify by the asset type using the asset manager. So within these project settings, we can cook specific maps, for example. So using our map cooking example, as we've been building upon from a very basic to a more advanced, this is definitely getting into the more advanced territory. So if we're in the project settings, you can go to the asset manager. And if you cook only maps with the folder, you can see the directory here, which is the index 0, and it just says game maps. So it basically gets any maps within this folder to cook. So you can imagine if you had a subfolder in maps called level 1, and maybe you had 17 maps as part of level 1 for whatever reason. If you just specified level 1, it would only cook level 1 and leave out all the other maps. So this is a nice flexible solution to point towards a folder instead of a list of maps, as we saw previously, because if you're changing the map names or you're adding and removing maps, that previous example of listing all the maps in the array, it's less flexible because you have to keep jumping in and out of that. Whereas if you're just pointing towards a specific directory, you can just say, whatever maps are in this directory, cook them. It's a little bit more flexible in that respect. So you can go into much more complexity, but that just gives you an idea of what the asset manager is. And then the project launcher gives you the ability to deploy on different platforms, all from one location, and even from a single launch profile. So you could make builds for 7 different target platforms, all through the platform launcher. And again, I've linked the documentation for if you care about the project launcher, and especially if you're shipping on multiple platforms and wanting to check builds across those multiple platforms, this will be a big saver of time for you. So each platform has its own profile that's listed in the window here, and you can also choose to create custom profiles. So I'm making an awesome game today, so I've made an awesome profile, and you can define the settings per deployment in the actual project launcher. So you could have multiple profiles. Maybe you're trying to do a quick development build for one series of build tests, and maybe you want like a fully cooked, robust, fully performant type of profile setup that you're really digging into the content. Or maybe you're shipping some DLC and you just want to test the DLC, for example. Platform Launcher can be configured to just help you kind of plan the content that you're trying to deploy into just a much more, I guess, streamlined way, especially if you're switching between different profiles and testing different things throughout the day. So Project Launcher is great for that. Now, you might have seen a couple of different cook options when you've been cooking your game projects. So you'll have seen cook by the book and cook on the fly. Now, cook on the book essentially just cooks from start to finish. So it takes the entirety of the cook process and cooks all the content before you start playing, so that all assets are loaded at once rather than on an ad hoc basis. So this is really useful if you're iterating on individual assets, or definitely want to ensure that the game is performing at the full speed. If you're just saying, cook my game, I want to test how it might be for a player, cook by the book is the option that you want to go for. There is also a cook on the fly option where it's cooking as you're playing the game. So only the executable and some of the basic files are installed, and then it uses the network communication on a cook server to make requests on demand. So as assets are being demanded, it's cooking on the fly. So which implies the name cook on the fly. It just allows you for faster iteration. It gets the build up and running faster. And if you're trying to make changes quickly and just test those cook changes, that can be useful for that. But for the most part, especially on the Fellowship, you'll be selecting cook by the book. So let's talk a little bit about game packaging now. So as a very valid question appeared at the very start that James highlighted, you've got the difference between development builds and shipping builds. There are other packaging configurations. As you can see there, you've got the debug game as well. If you want to get more granular, I've linked the documentation, but for today, let's just talk about development and shipping builds, since they're the two primary use cases that you'll be looking at for your projects. So whoever asks a question, you could screenshot this page. This will be the kind of main go-to resource for the development and shipping build. So let's kind of break down exactly what's happening between development and shipping and why you would use different options. So for the most part, across the Fellowship, maybe you want to be making development builds frequently throughout the week, across multiple weeks. I'd still recommend maybe making one or two shipping builds here and there, but you just want to make sure that your content is being cooked correctly across both builds. So the purpose of the development build is for testing and development. It kind of says the name there. The reason why you'd want a shipping build is if you're distributing this to people that you don't know directly. Maybe you're not looking for playtest feedback. Maybe this is the final version of your game and it's a public release. It's kind of it's worth creating both versions of the build and having one of each just in case you need it. But development build 9 times out of 10 is what you'll be going for. And the reason why that is that the debug symbols and login are included in development build. So with a shipping build, it kind of closes off all the information. So you can't really access stuff at runtime. Whereas a development build, you can debug it and, something might be breaking inside a build as opposed to your editor. And that's why builds are so important. So when we've been suggesting to make builds throughout the week, first of all, we want to make sure it's packaging, of course, but you also want to check that the gameplay experience in the development build is the same as the editor. When we're looking at cooked content, if maybe certain textures aren't being cooked or there's something breaking in the development build, it may not show it in editor because the editor is more forgiving. The editor will just load all the content because the editor knows that it's there. Whereas in the build, you might see that a map might not load because it wasn't cooked as part of the process, or maybe a texture is missing. So that's kind of why we want to create builds to get the best representation of what the player might be playing in build. We can also access console commands and profiling tools and visual debugging aids. So we could show collision boxes, for example, in a development build, so we can test if something's colliding correctly. Whereas in a shipping build, they are disabled and removed. Now, I've got a Unreal Fest talk linked in a little bit, and Ari, who actually does a lot of Unreal Fest talks, has said, given little tips about you can actually access some information in shipping builds. It's not 100% disabled and removed. However, just for our best understanding right now, in a shipping build, most kind of profiling and debugging is disabled in a shipping build, although there are little edge cases that we don't really need to worry about. But if someone wants to pursue that, I've got some links later on. Especially if you shipped a game, for example, and you're trying to get some kind of information about a crash or something like that, there are some tools you can use there. In development builds, your games are less optimized. So it's not try to cook everything perfectly, it's just try to get a build. So it's going to be less optimized. It's focusing on functionality over everything else. And it can have a larger file size because of that. It's not trying to optimize the cook because it's just got the extra data in there. Whereas when you get to a shipping build, it's optimized for performance on the target platform. It's going to have a smaller file size due to removing that extra data. So if you're trying to hit, 60 frames a second on a PlayStation 5, for example, if you're specifically measuring for frame rate, you should check the shipping build as well as the development build, but your shipping build will be your kind of North Star of performance data. Development build will skew, and it can even be between I might be making stuff up now, but like 5 and 15 milliseconds, for example. Like things can change quite drastically between development and shipping build. So you want to be checking shipping builds, especially if you're checking for performance or even just the file size of your game on disk, anything like that, you want to be using the shipping build as the metric for that. And when it comes to distribution and deployment, you shouldn't really deploy development builds because players can access things like console commands. They can change how your game works through console commands. They could probably use cheats and things like this, any kind of debug tools, whereas you probably want to ship the shipping build, which is, especially if you're giving it to the public for release, that's just going to be the more secure version of the build. So as we've seen over the last couple of weeks, lots of red text in the output log. How do we fix these? What's going on? Kind of help me type of scenario. So as we've been advising, the packaging process should be run at regular intervals. If you intend that a packaged project is the main outcome, which for the fellowship, a packaged project is the main intended outcome there. And it'll help us clean errors as we go rather than rushing it at the end. So it's not that, if we're doing it up front, it's wasted time because any errors that we're fixing now don't compound later in the project's development. So first of all, we want to make sure there's no extraneous references to any of the assets that you're deleting anywhere in the project. So if you've been prototyping a blueprint and you've got a lot of test variables just down the left-hand side, it's just like, I tried this thing, it didn't work, but I left it there. That can cause packaging issues because you could have referenced that variable in another blueprint. It could be referencing an actor that no longer exists. Anything could be happening with these variables on the left-hand side. So if you've been prototyping a lot and you've not been kind of cleaning your project as you go, this can lead to packaging issues. So just open up blueprints that you've been prototyping, make sure you're deleting variables as you go. Now, a small note, now this shouldn't be a heavy-handed tool to use, but if anyone has their engine open at the moment, if you open a blueprint, any blueprint is fine. And if you go to edit at the top of your screen, you'll see towards the bottom of that menu, a delete all unused variables option. So if you have a blueprint open, go to edit, delete all unused variables. Just a word of caution, you should use this with a light touch. If you know that this is an isolated blueprint and you've just been testing stuff and you're fine to delete everything, go ahead and click that. It saves you from right-click delete, right-click delete, right-click delete on all these variables because you can't shift select the variables. At least I don't think you can. So that can be a tip, but it's also a very heavy-handed tool. You should ideally go through and just make sure everything is okay. But if you know you want to delete a lot of variables in one go to edit, delete all variables. Just a word of caution that could cause issues if you're deleting stuff. It would delete it for an example of that. If you've got a variable in a blueprint and you're not actively using that variable in this blueprint, but you reference that variable in another blueprint and it's more of a soft reference, Unreal might delete this variable in the first blueprint because it doesn't think it's being used anywhere, even though this second blueprint does care about that. It can lead to issues like that. So you just really want to make sure you're being conscious of what tools you're using, especially if they're a heavy-handed tool. As we've said a few times as well, you want to make sure you update redirector references. So do this on a daily basis. If you've never done it and you have a lot of content in your project, you could not only just go to the content folder, but go to the subfolders and right-click on each subfolder, update redirector references, and just go folder by folder. It's the more careful and clean approach. If you're doing that often, you can start to click on content, right-click, update redirect references, and that cleans up all of your content folder. It gets everything. Now, again, that's a heavy-handed approach, but if you know you've been staying on top of that, you want to on each subfolder, update redirector references, and just go folder by folder. It's the more careful and clean approach. If you're doing that often, you can start to click on content, right-click, update redirect references, and that cleans up all of your content folder. It gets everything. Now, again, that's a heavy-handed approach, but if you know you've been staying on top of that, you want to make sure you update redirector references. And essentially what a redirector is say you've got a character in one folder, and it doesn't matter what kind of actor it is. It could be a character, it could be an audio file, any kind of asset type, but let's say character for now. And we move that character to a new folder just for organization, maybe for a loading purpose or something like that. But we've moved this character. Now, even though your character exists in this second folder, Unreal has left a little breadcrumb behind called a redirector. That when the game's looking for the character, first it goes to the folder that you first placed it in and says, is there a character here? And Unreal says, no, the character's not here, but it's over here. So you can imagine if you move the character 3 or 4 times and it's just like, no, not here, it's here, no, it's not here, it's here. And you've got this redirector kind of chain of events. You don't want these redirectors in your project when you come to packaging. You want to make sure everything's cleaned up and organized. So by clicking this button, that will prevent that issue from happening. Now, this has happened a couple of times on the Fellowship, where for an unknown reason, maybe it's a plugin issue, maybe someone's changed some configuration settings that they weren't aware that they were changing, but they've forgotten what they did. Something is broken in the project where we're not really getting any information about why the project's not packaging, but it's not packaging. What you can do is you can right-click on a level that you're using. Say it's got all your assets in this level. You can right-click on this level, go to Asset Actions, and click Migrate. And what you can do is you can get this level and say, I want to put this level in a new project. So if you create an empty project, and it's just a completely empty, kind of clean project, but you know packages, there's no content in there, and you migrate this level that's got all your content in into the new project, it will take with it all the actors and references that are in that level into the new project. So if you had some characters in there, if you had some audio, textures, static meshes, anything that's in the level, it will take with it so that that level loads and runs in the new project. And that's a really nice way of cleaning up a project. Now, again, it's a heavy-handed tool. I think we would prefer you to work in a clean, organized way, delete stuff that you're no longer using, clean up variables, update redirectors. But especially if you've got yourself into a situation where maybe you've added 20 different asset packs into your game, and maybe you're only using a couple of actors from one asset pack, and but the content is now 30 gigabytes or more in size, and you just want to try and clean up your folder, clean up your project. Migrating is a nice way of doing it. It does come with some caveats that if you're using certain blueprint communication and maybe function libraries or interfaces or any of this blueprint communication terminology, it may not take some of that information with it. It should, but it may not, and you may end up with compile issues. So this is more as a tool. Maybe you speak to your mentor and TA about doing this. If you feel comfortable with what you're doing, of course, go ahead and do it. But again, it's more of a heavy-handed tool. So just make sure you're only migrating as a kind of last case scenario. As we linked in the thread, these are some useful links to why your game might not be packaging. Visual Studio may just not have been installed correctly. And we've seen it quite a few times in this last couple of weeks where someone just tried uninstalling Visual Studio and re-downloading it over lunchtime, following the correct steps, and now the game's packaging okay. So, if we are experiencing packaging issues that aren't directly connected to some specific piece of content, it's worth just reinstalling Visual Studio to just sanity check that that is the case. From the last fellowship, the people credited along the bottom had found different SDK issues with what they had installed, and they provided solutions of what was breaking locally for them. Because more often than not, if a fellow sends me a project or a TL or other mentor a project, it packages on our PC, but it may not package on yours. And it kind of implies that it's a Visual Studio. So we don't know what you've installed via Visual Studio. So these links will hopefully help you a lot of the way. But of course, we can run tech support. But make sure you follow all these steps. Reinstall Visual Studio, clean up your projects as best you can, update redirector references, trying to package, and following these steps and then reaching out once you've tried them. Hopefully we can just help get to the bottom of why you might be experiencing a packaging issue. So some people on their projects will want to reduce package size as well. Maybe again, you're shipping for a certain target platform, or you really just want to get it as low as you can because you want to make sure people with slower internet speeds can still access your project. So there's a few tips here that you might want to follow. So firstly, starting with an empty project inside of Unreal Engine. If you make sure you start without any kind of sample content, don't start with a film or game template. When you open the editor, the project launcher, sorry, on the Epic launcher, and it says, what template do you want to use? If you just start with blank template, no content samples, none of the additional tick boxes, that is going to be your base version of Unreal, which is still, not an insignificant file size, but at least it's a base version of Unreal, and you can build from there. And that will definitely help bring your project size down. Now, you can also click an option inside of project settings called compressed cooked packages. And if you enable that, it will just really try and compress the cooked file size down even more. Now, again, I'd only use this in an example where you're really trying to reduce the file size on disk, but that is an option if that happens to be your project. don't include editor content when cooking. So you can change the option that in the package process where you can exclude editor content. And again, that's in the project settings, but you just want to make sure that you're not using editor content if you do exclude this. So some of you will have used a cube, for example. Now, the cube, some versions of the cube static mesh will be in engine content and not your editor content. So if you have a cube, for example, if you find that cube in the the content browser, either pressing Control and B to browse where it is in the content browser, or you just search for the static mesh. If that subfolder ends up inside of engine content in your content browser, that means you're using editor content. So what you can do is you can drag and drop that cube into your project's content, make a copy of it, don't move it, always make a copy, and then update the reference to that, update redirector references as well. So just to make sure you're not including any editor content. But if you're not using editor content, that can be a way to reduce your file size as well. So to reiterate from a previous slide as well, development builds are going to be larger than shipping builds. So if you're really caring about the performance, the file size, sorry, run a shipping build over a development build. Make sure you're only cooking the maps that you need. So like we said, Unreal will cook all the maps. Be specific about what maps you want if you're trying to reduce the file size. Now you can also use something called the size map on your assets to determine if there's anything there that shouldn't be. So the size map has a documentation page. It's worth checking out, and it's a really nice visual tool actually. So you'd right click on a blueprint, go to size map as a tool, and what it'll show you, you can do this if you have your editor open right now. Just right click the asset, go to size map, maybe on a blueprint that has lots of different components to it, and you'll see that, say it's a character blueprint, you'll see on the size map that the character skeletal mesh will be taking up a certain amount of memory in your blueprint. Maybe there's a few audio sounds attached to the blueprint as well. They'll be taking up some size in your blueprint. Maybe you've got some 4K textures in there that could be reduced because they don't need to be 4K on screen. Either way, the size map will reference everything that's being loaded as part of that blueprint. And so that's a really good way to optimize some of the content that shouldn't be there. As we said, you can migrate maps into a new project as well. So if you found yourself with just a massive project and you just want to strip out some of the content, you can migrate those maps. But just remember that caveat of, it is more of a heavy-handed solution. So I would try and avoid that if possible. We can also remove unnecessary plugins, especially if you started with a template that maybe on the film and TV template, you've got a lot of virtual production plugins enabled that are just not needed. You can go through and remove those plugins. You can see what plugins are currently enabled by going to Edit at the top of your window, down to the window Plugins. I think it's the bottom of the list there. If you don't know what that plugin is doing, don't just disable it. Don't go heavy-handed. But if you see plugins in there that you're definitely not using in your project, you can disable them case by case. Again, I'd probably disable something, try and package a game. Is everything still packaging okay? Okay, maybe disable more. As with all these steps, try and do it incrementally and try and make small gains rather than just going heavy-handed, disabling 10 different plugins. Now your project isn't compiling, but you're not sure what broke it. Just take a careful step here. There's a Oodle texture plugin as well, which was interesting. I wasn't aware of this, and it's actually a reference that Tom Lumen gave me, so credit to Tom Lumen there. But there's a Oodle texture plugin that compresses textures even further than what Unreal would compress them to. I think it is more of a heavy-handed solution, and I think it actually impacts the actual compression of that texture, and it's hard to revert back from that. unless you have some kind of source control. So again, that's probably a more heavy-handed approach if you're really trying to reduce texture size on disk, but it's there if you need it. And also Nano is a really interesting thing as I was trying to research some tips that I hadn't come across before, but it's essentially a GitHub for people that want to make the smallest possible, I should say UE5, because it was made for UE, oh, well, actually UE4 and UE5, I think, but it's essentially a GitHub link that you can make super small versions of Unreal games. I think there's like accolades. I guess it's more just social cred for having the smallest Unreal game, but that's kind of fun to see that people are actively trying to work on reducing these file sizes. So you don't have to follow these tips, but if package size is a focus, they're worth exploring. So most people in the fellowship, this should not be an issue, but especially if you're making packaged games for distribution, it's worth considering making sure people aren't downloading more content than they need to. Again, especially if they have, lower internet speeds or anything like that. So not all of you will be working on development teams using Unreal Engine, but it's useful to be aware, especially if you have build processes in place where you've got some build automations or anything like this set up in your teams already. And you're thinking, okay, we need to move to Unreal Engine, but it's going to disrupt all our architecture. How do we approach this? Hopefully, there's some good tips for teams wanting to work inside of Unreal Engine. So first of all, we've got the UAT, which is the Unreal Automation tool, and it enables you to cook and package your game using command lines. So essentially, we don't have to have the editor open in order to cook and package our games. We do have access to automation tools. So that will obviously speed up build iteration. It can be run directly on the command line with runuat.bat when provided with valid arguments. And the batch files that you need can be found in that engine folder link. So if you wanted to look into Unreal Automation Tool, that's some starting off points. Got the documentation below, and just be mindful that if you are on something other than Windows, or for example Mac and Linux, you've got a different file to run there. Command lines are accessible in Unreal Engine, like we just said on the previous slide. So a basic cook can be performed using these command line arguments. We can use either the UE5 editor exe or the editor CMD exe. And the main thing here is that the commandlet must be specified via the -run equals cook, and a platform must be specified. And then if you use an example command line like we've got here, build will then be saved in that file location below. So you can specify where the builds go, make sure you specify the platform, and you can automate those builds and spit them out into a folder of your choosing. And you could even then, have them uploaded to the rest of the team, however you want to handle that. So there's some more documentation for how you might approach the command line content. To give you a bit of background about how Unreal goes from the initial build to the player running the game, we kind of break it down into these six different stages. So first of all, you'll click build, and this stage is the compiles the executable for the selected platform. So it says, okay, I know what I'm building for, I know where I'm going. Then we move into the cook process. So as we've been speaking about at the start of the course, you're then kind of cooking all the content for that specific platform. We then move into staging, which copies the executable and the content from a staging area to a standalone directory, which is outside of the development directory. So it's just kind of prepared the files to be packaged, and then we package the stage project files into that native distribution format that we were talking about before, where, if we take in those raw assets, content files such as PNGs or WAVs or whatever it might be, now we're getting it in the native format for the platform. We can then deploy the build to the target device, and then running the build starts that deployed build up. So they're the kind of step-by-steps that Unreal goes through. And of course, then you can insert into your build pipeline at any point the data that you need based on those different stages. So a really useful tool, especially if you're working in teams, will be the Unreal Build tool. So sometimes referred to as UBT, although I don't really see it referred to as that, but I included it anyway. Generally, you'll see it as Unreal Build tool, and it's a custom tool that manages the process of building Unreal Engine source code across a variety of configs. So you can read the CS file that I've highlighted there to explore the different configurable build options, and we've got the documentation below. There's two different documentation links there for anything on the Unreal Build tool, if that's of interest to you. Now we've also got a nice, it's more of a visual front end for getting game projects distributed across teams, and it's called the Unreal Game Sync. So, and this is referred to as UGS, is a tool that promotes code and content integration in a collaborative development environment. So say you've got multiple team members working on a project and you're currently using source control or something like that. This is more of a visual wrapper, still with that same under the hood content, but it allows people to ensure that the content that they're pulling is correct and the latest version of it. So it's a just nice graphical front end to sync files. And someone asked on the last fellowship, is Unreal Game Sync specific to Perforce? And I believe, yes, it is specific to Perforce. So there's some documentation on this, but I also wanted to give you a rundown about how Unreal Game Sync might work for teams. So you'll see the top line image here is the general programming workflow where you'll sync to Perforce, resolve any conflicts, update the version files, generate the project files, build them to make sure things are running correctly, and then run. So as part of this kind of process, you've got that kind of build run stage where not every developer on your team will want to do that. So say, for an example, an artist is working on the game. You don't want them to have to build content files, project files all the time. So if artists are using Unreal Game Sync, they can essentially update the version files and then just run because they know that any conflicts have been resolved. They've got all the correct binaries, they've got the correct version files, and they can just load their Unreal project. So it kind of is a nice workflow for the people not working in the source code of the project. So definitely worth checking out for teams wanting to use that. Now, over the year, you'll see more and more teams or more and more presentations on this that teams might want to start looking at. So Horde has essentially just started being integrated into the engine over the last couple of engine releases. And Horde is essentially a series of services supporting the workflows that Epic uses to develop Fortnite and Unreal and various things that Epic are working on. And it's worth getting your teams to look at. So if you're wanting to check out all the latest build processes, Horde is where it's kind of being directed. That doesn't negate anything that I've just previously said. It actually integrates all those separate aspects into one workflow process. So Horde will actually offer multiple different bits of functionality. So we've got remote execution, which uses the Unreal Build Accelerator. You've got build automation, especially designed for teams working with large Perforce repositories, such as a Fortnite repository. You can test the automation, and the automation tool and Gauntlet are worth checking out as well. These are tools that Unreal uses, not necessarily widely documented or there's tutorials about, but very useful for teams to be looking at. You've got telemetry data from the analytics. Again, you've got Unreal Game Sync, which we mentioned just in the previous slide, and you've got device managers as part of Horde. So it kind of just streamlines everything into one. So instead of using three or four different tools that have to speak to each other. Horde is designed to encompass everything into one end-to-end workflow, essentially. So the great talk that I referenced earlier on, which especially if you're a studio starting to use Unreal Engine and wanting to get up to scratch with the latest kind of processes or tools, anything like that, that talk from UE Fest in Prague last year, or earlier this year, should we say, is definitely worth a watch. So yeah, any teams wanting to use Unreal, I would highly recommend that talk. And this is the last step now. So we're getting to the end, and then we'll do a very quick demo just to close out, and then can answer any questions that haven't been answered in the chat. So the Unreal Engine EULA can be found online. It's worth checking out, especially if you're wanting to ship games using Unreal Engine. Essentially, you can use Unreal for free. You don't have to pay per seat cost. There's no upfront cost, subscription fee, excuse me, anything like that. So when you monetize, essentially ship your game, there's a 5% royalty, and that's 5% royalties on gross revenue. And then royalties are waived on the first million. So if you don't get $1 million in revenue, you don't pay Epic anything, and it's only after the 1 million, from 1 million onwards, that you'd pay the 5% royalty, and that's on gross revenue. Everyone has access to the same features, so you can download the Unreal source code, you can extend the source code for yourself. All platforms are included. If you are working on consoles, you just have to register as the developer, and then you get access to all the platform source as well. So yeah, essentially you get everything included. But the EULA is definitely where you would go to find out all the specific info. And when I was doing my research for this course, I realized that this phrase had been used quite a lot over the years. I remember this becoming a thing in 2004. And the phrase is, "We succeed when you succeed." And this is since 2014, which is actually when we first started shipping our first game in UDK. And you can see the URL that Epic is giving away 5 million USD to devs using Unreal Engine 4. And since then, through the mega grant process, they've given away way more than 5 million. So much has gone through the mega grant program, and it is really part of the ecosystem that is a philosophy of Epic where, you know, when we succeed, when you succeed, really is a kind of stake in the ground to build your games around. Because, as I said, like anything over under $1 million in revenue, you're not paying royalties for, which means you can start building a sustainable studio and slowly grow from there. And it's only when you generate meaningful revenue that you start paying the royalties. So at least from a development perspective, I definitely see that as a very fair way to approach it. The main thing you want to do is, and I've kind of tried to use color, I've tried to use bold font, I've tried to use underlines. Just remember to complete the form before release, especially if you're thinking of releasing your Fellowship game for $2.99 on the Epic Games Store and it sells 100 million units in the first week. Just remember, you should fill out this form before the release. You just need to make Epic aware that you are about to release something. You really need to fill out this form before release. Yeah, highlighted it, bolded it. Just remember, like if any people on this call are thinking about shipping anything commercially, please do this as early as you can. And then in terms of the Epic Games Store, it's open to developers and publishers. So if you want to upload your game onto the Epic Games Store, you can do. There's self-publishing tools available. The rev share is 88 to 12 revenue split, which is very fair compared to a lot of other PC platforms, which are also fair, but this is more generous to developers. So if you want to find anything about the distribution there, there's the URL to follow there. And let's tie off with a little bit of live Unreal Engine work, just to show how we can customize some of the features in our games. Nice, fun little exercise to close out. Can answer any questions. But essentially, we'll edit some project settings. We'll change the icon, maybe our name, copyright. We'll add a splash screen and then package our game, and then discuss the package files. So let's do that now. I'm gonna switch my screen to my awesome project. So we were making an awesome game before, so this is the awesome project. But you'll also see that I've completely ripped off the first person template because this is the first person template. Now, what we want to do is, because we were talking about project settings so long, it makes sense that we want to edit our project settings. So you don't have to follow along here. I'm doing some basic things, but also if you would like to, feel free. So I'm going to go to edit at the top. I'm going to go down to project settings. We're back in project settings. So in case you missed it, we just go to edit project settings. And here you can change many things about your game. If we wanted to change the project name to Awesome Game, we can do that. Been working on this game a little while now, so it's version 1.5.8.1. Gone through many iterations. We can add a company name. You get the idea. We can do all these things. Now, the fun thing to do is giving your game an icon for the launcher, because when you load your game and see the Windows toolbar or any kind of launcher bar for your game, you can actually customize the icon. So it's not your project thumbnail, it's called icon. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to search icon in the project settings. As we said before, just search the property and then try and navigate. So you've got Android specific icons, you've got iOS specific icons. You can see all these different platform specific icons, but I want Windows because I'm going to deploy to Windows first. So you can see that the game icon is currently the Unreal game icon. Now, I'm not necessarily a pro in Photoshop, but what I did was I got the awesome game, I got the Unreal game icon, I exported it, changed the color to pink, and now I'm re-importing it. So what you want to note here is that it's an ICO file type. Okay, so in Photoshop, or you can get if you just Google how to create ICO file type on Google, it'll show you how to save this type of icon, but all your icon files need to be ICO. I've just done 256 by 256, and I'm going to select that. Now with my game icon, when I load up the game, you can see that it's going to be pink, just to give you an idea. So you can import your own game icons. Feel free to create a fun icon for the Fellowship. Make sure you have your game loop in place first and everything. This is just purely a polish task, but it can be a very satisfying thing to have a game icon because it makes it feel more final. What I also want to do is I want to update the splash. Now you can see that if I scroll to the top, I've got my Linux splash screens, got my platforms, Mac screen there, and I've got my Windows. Now I can have an editor splash screen and a game splash screen. So if I want to load my editor with like a cool little splash that just says like, work in progress, just make a fun splash screen for the team, especially if you're working on multiple people, just make a fun splash screen for the game to load. You can do that. Or alternatively, you can do just the game splash, which is, when you're loading up the game. So I'll just change both of these. I've got a splash and an editor splash. Same in those packaging assets. Now, these are BMP file types. I've made it BMP because that's what Unreal uses by default. I believe a PNG might work equally well here. I've just kept the same resolutions, but if you want to import your own image here, it doesn't need to keep the aspect ratio. So these dimensions are 720 by 405. You can make these dimensions whatever you want, and that will load up the game with that splash screen. So as you all probably saw in the templates, I updated the template to have this cool splash screen, which was what the Fellowship was originally advertised with. So it's just always nice adding that bit of customization. Now, it says 2 changes to source content files have been detected. Would you like to import them? So I'm just going to import these, and they actually bring them into my project now. Now I've got source control connected here. You don't need source control, but if you notice now in my content folder, if I go to Splash, it's just put them here. So that's kind of just a nice organizational way to have these as part of my project. Now, if I want to change any other content settings, I can do, but I'm pretty happy with everything now. So I'm just going to file, save all. I've not changed anything, but it's always good just to sanity check. And I'm just going to package my game. So I'm going to go to Platforms, Windows, Package Project. I've created just a folder on my desktop called Builds. So I'm just going to put this in here. Put it in whatever location you want to, but I'm just going to select Builds, and therefore it's going to package the game. Now, as I said before, this is a great chance to make coffee. If you've never done this and you've just been importing gigabytes and gigabytes of content, this is going to take a while. This is not going to take a while now because I've just got the first person template and I've already packaged, but there you go. So it's done. Now, if you've not done this before, it's worth leaving it over lunchtime or in the evening just before you switch, or like just leave your computer on and leave it going whilst you go and watch TV or something like that. And it's worth highlighting that Unreal will iterate on the cooking by default, unless you change this. So by default, it will iterative cook. And what that means is if Unreal cooks your project once and it takes 1 hour, say you only change like 5% of the content. I'm going to get my math wrong here, but 5% of the content. Now that's 3 minutes of an hour. Yeah, 3 minutes. So it will then take 3 minutes to cook that 5% of content because it's only changing 5% of the content. Essentially, not to confuse anyone, it will skip over all the content that's already been cooked and only cook that small amount of information. So iterative cook doesn't take your whole project and say it takes 1 hour. It's not going to take 1 hour the second time. It's going to only cook the content that it doesn't know about or content that has changed. So it's worth cooking early, and then every subsequent build, as long as you're not adding loads and loads of content every time, is going to get quicker. So that's essentially our cooked game. Now, if I go to my desktop and I go to my builds, you'll see that I've got my Windows build here. I could just change this to Awesome Game before I zip it up. And you'll see that if I have my Awesome Game here, you'll see that I've got my pink project, which was nice because I updated that. And if I made an even cooler icon, you'd be able to see that. And essentially, if you want to share this now with anyone, you can right click, zip it up, and upload it. But that's essentially it. It's just a nice, straightforward way. Of course, my game packaged well, just because, first of all, I know my Visual Studio is installed correctly because I use it on a daily basis. And also, I'm only using the first person template and I've not changed anything. So that is obviously kind of a very straightforward process. And no doubt you all have very complex projects and there's a lot of things going on. We can help you fix those build errors throughout the week. I'll stop sharing now. Stop share. And we can jump in with questions, but essentially it would be good to leave today with at least a game packaging. A couple of people have sent me games that aren't packaging correctly, which I'll check out and see if I can figure out the errors, because sometimes you just get either like unknown error or errors that aren't relating to any direct piece of content. So sometimes it's easier just to try and debug it. But yeah, let's maybe do some questions, or at least if we have no questions throughout the day, we can help people package their games. So yeah, is there anything that hasn't been answered or we want to discuss maybe as part of the course here?
I think for any questions relating to build issues that people are going to have all over the place, I think we have a lab now, so we can kind of go in, and most people will have very, very similar issues as well, so we should be able to
Exactly. Yep.
to do it. Someone's asking if you can show them how to package just 2 levels, just through the process of packaging that. Maybe that's something that you can show.
Yeah, definitely. So it's the maps to cook that we looked at before. So I'm going to go to edit project settings. And something I actually is worth highlighting. Oh, my input breaks. Does anyone remember how to fix this on Zoom? Like whenever I click an option, it doesn't go to it.
As far as I know, you have to stop sharing and reshare.
Okay, let me just
It's
stop
annoying.
sharing. Just going to stop sharing. I'm clicking that maps and modes button. So just so people know, I'll go back to it now. Strange how Zoom does that. But yeah, I've clicked on maps and modes. You can actually change the editor startup map and the game default map. So, if you're working on level 1 at the moment and you just always want level 1 to open, you can just assign it there. Same with the game default map. When you load an executable, do you want the title map to load there? Do you want a different map? That's what's good there. So anyway, project settings, maps, do cook, and this is what we were discussing in the presentation just previously. So we've got maps to cook and we've got list of maps to include in a package build. I can just add maps here and select them from the directory. So I want to just go to, so it would be content, maps, whatever the map might be, or I don't know I don't know how many maps I have in this project, but I could also I'll just stop sharing just in case I have to go through my documents. So I'll just pause. I'm just gonna load up the project. Just in documents by default, which is why I probably don't want to share my screen. This person, maps. Yeah, okay. So I've just navigated through the project files to the first person map, and I can find the first person map there. So I can just go through and select maps that I want to cook based on that, if that helps people as well. Yeah, that's how you would do that. Hopefully the subject was interesting. It is like game packaging isn't like the sexiest of topics, but hopefully you got all the information you needed to at least, understand a little bit more about what buttons you're clicking. And also if you're working in teams, how to work with Unreal in a larger scale outside of just yourself. So yeah, hopefully people find it interesting. And as James said, that's essentially all of the major kind of classes complete now. You got a couple of evening optimization classes, things like this, but now we can just focus on just heads down on the core loops of your game and getting all the things that you want in, just for you to all be proud of your game. So yeah, hopefully you all found it interesting today. Thanks for hanging around and sharing your questions.